Hello, everyone. Welcome to the binary episode of the podcast for this week. Before we get into the topics, we'll cover the Spot the Vuln challenge that we had on the pre-stream for today and yesterday's episode. So Z, I'll let you take that away, and then we'll get into our topics this week.
Yeah, this week's Vuln was based on something I believe we covered in episode 63 or 61. It looks like episode 61, an incorrect calculation bug in the Linux kernel eBPF verifier. So what's happening with this one is essentially more of a logical issue than it can lead to a binary or memory corruption type issue. But the issue just has to do with how the verifier, the intent here is that it's going to calculate what the minimum and maximum possible values are for that destination register. It's just trying to go through and make sure like you're not overflowing anything, you're not accessing anything outside of the expected range, uh, validating your code before it actually tries to run it. So in doing that, if you take a look at the code, little code snippet that we did bring up, it is on line 9 where destination value for the left shift is calculated. Just takes the minimum value, left shifts it by that minimum value, creates minimum value. Similarly, line 14, being the max value does the left shift by the potential maximum value. That's going to give you the maximum resultant value. So those two are correct. But when you take a look at the right shift code, the problem there, especially if you're looking at line 22, when it's trying to calculate the, so it's lines 20 and 22, calculating the minimum value, it's doing a right shift. Um, I'm just trying to get this straight in my head. Yeah. So it's doing a right shift by the minimum value, and your right shifts are kind of like doing a division by 2. It's going down, like it's shifting all the bits over. So using the minimum value there is basically the wrong idea. You would want to shift it to get the minimum value or the minimum possible resultant value. You would want to shift by the maximum possible shift. That would give you the minimum result, and the maximum value would be shifting it by as little as possible. So they have those two switched around. That's where the vulnerability comes in. You could use that. Ultimately, it's calculating the wrong potential ranges, so you can create code that will actually go outside of the expected range and get an out of bounds calculation from it.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, this was a bug that was covered by ZDI on their blog, I think, and we commented at the time how it was like a really interesting and kind of subtle bug that you really had to understand what the code was doing to spot it. It's not something that's super obvious.
Well,
So
I mean, when you understand like the min and max idea, it does feel a little bit obvious. Um, but it is something that requires an understanding, like you're saying, of the actual application and its intent. But it's a more logical issue than just like a subtle calculation. Like it's just calculating the wrong value for each of those. I think I speculated back when we were covering it that this might have been the sort of issue that's created when you're copying and pasting code and then just kind of filling things in like that, not really thinking about the differences between left shift and right shift, just copying the code from one to the other and making it work.
I remember that. Yeah. Nonetheless, though, yeah, I mean, this was a very good issue to pull for the Spot the Vuln challenge. Um, I actually don't remember if anyone guessed it right in our Spot the Vuln Discord. I noticed some people were talking about it and trying to figure it out, but I never checked after to see if somebody got the right guess there. But yeah, I mean, interesting issue. Anyway,
Yeah.
with that out of the way, we'll get into our topics for this week. So we'll start off with something somewhat easy. It's in the this is the HP OMEN Gaming Hub utility, which is used for things like CPU and GPU overclocking, fan speeds, RGB control. As such, it's probably not too surprising that our first vulnerability here was found and reported in a product like this. A lot of these kinds of software are pretty damn bad code quality on the driver side, from what I've heard from other people who do Windows stuff. Um, and following that line, this issue is kind of a joke. Um, It's mainly based on the fact that the HP port IOX64 driver is based on the WinRing 0 driver, developed by OpenLibsys, and the capabilities this driver exposes to unprivileged users is bananas. It lets you read and write to kernel memory. It lets you access I/O ports, PCIe configuration, MSRs. I mean, basically everything that you could imagine that would give a powerful, like low-level capability is exposed by this driver.
And I mean,
Um,
it's doing it effectively, it seems. It's just providing like directly access to these primitives. It's not even a vulnerability really leading to them. The vulnerability is the fact that like they just expose it.
yeah. Um, and as much as I'd like to say this is really weird and this is messed up, this isn't like super uncommon for a lot of these like gamer type utility drivers. So,
I mean,
um,
we've covered I think one other one before. It wasn't HBO, I mean it was something else, but at least with that time, like it still felt like they were doing some code in, in the driver, not outsourcing it. Well, outsourcing it all to userland, just enabling userland to do everything, which is what it seems like here. Especially some of these low level primitives like, reading and writing the IO ports. Like, that really shouldn't be a primitive you need to expose to your userland program.
yeah, if I had to hazard a guess as to what the thinking was there are people that are rightfully scared to put a lot of code in the kernel. Any code that you put in the kernel, if there's something wrong, it blows it up. So wanting to keep the amount of code you have in the kernel minimal and then trying to move as much as you can to user space does make sense. But you have to kind of strike a balance between um, leaving as little code in the kernel as possible and also making sure that that doesn't mean just making it so you can access these stupid primitives from user space. And that balance, I think, was where the failure was here.
And I mean,
Um,
moving on from the actual fact that these are exposed, as a write up, it did cover some interesting points about what you could do with some of these primitives. Because, like, access on like an arbitrary in and out call isn't necessarily a common primitive that you're going to see. You definitely may be able to gain it in some things, but like, that's not usually the primitives you have when dealing with exploitation. So there was at least a little bit of insight into that. I think they also covered like the reading and writing model specific registers. Uh oh, what else was there in here?
I think they used the like ADA PIO rights to corrupt the MBR, which is kind of a common thing that things like ransomware and whatnot do. Well, actually, not really ransomware, but some of those worm type attacks that we've seen before that just cause devastation to machines. But yeah, like there's a bunch of other attacks that could have been used here where you have so many options. Um,
Yeah, I mean, you have like very powerful like, for the most part, gaining a lot of these primitives could potentially be the end game scenario of a full exploit chain. A little bit questionable. We were talking about a little bit before the stream about the actual exploitability of some of these, given the fact that you've got things like kernel patch protection in place, from Linux, some secure boot stuff. You've got various. I guess Linux doesn't really matter here, but this is a Windows driver. But you do have some protections in place that would at least attempt to protect from some things, but they're very powerful primitives.
so that's the main thing that stood out to me. And the article does touch on this towards the end, talking about how they would be at least somewhat mitigated through virtualization-based security. Microsoft has done a lot of work on Windows and integrating it with things like Hyper-V to try to make it so even if these really dumb primitives get exposed, or if an exploit is written that can gain one of these primitives, that it's hard to really do any damage with. Um, so it's kind of funny because you look at these and you're like, wow, these are powerful capabilities. But then it's not as straightforward when it goes to attacking it. Now, I can't comment too much on the specifics of which ones, like which attacks they detailed are possible and which ones aren't, because I'm not a Windows researcher. I don't really look at secure boot or virtualization-based security, but I
Uh,
believe it should defend against some of these things, like writing to certain MSRs and whatnot.
It
So,
would, except virtualization-based security is not the default on like Windows 10 Personal. I believe you need to be on Windows 10 Pro to go onto that, and you need to enable it yourself. It's not something that's enabled by default. Part
for
of
what?
that's
Sorry.
for virtualization-based security for all of that, like running, because effectively how it works, they'll run Windows under Hyper-V. So the
So,
only way you get that is through the enabling, which I don't believe, unless I think there was some change in a recent Windows update, or recent said like in the last like 6 to 10 months, I think,
so that's
where
what I was going to get into because, as far as I understood it, you're right. You can't access Hyper-V directly as a user if you're on a Windows Home license, but I believe it still uses Hyper-V even if you're on the home license for things like secure boot.
see that's what I was going to
So
say, where I think there were some changes in the last little while where they did start making it more accessible. And that was partially with WSL2 coming out too, is now using Hyper-V even if you're just on the personal edition. But I do know there is some separate virtualization protection that's still like I run Win 10 Pro. And I had to go through a lot of hoops to actually get that enabled.
yeah,
So just something to consider. I don't think all of the hypervisor protections are available by default, at the very least.
okay. Microsoft has been going really hard on the virtualization backed security stuff. You can see that with
I
what
mean,
they've been
it's a
doing with
smart
Windows 10
move.
and what they're going with Windows 11, trying to enforce things like secure boot and whatnot. Yeah, it is a really smart move, and Microsoft's just been really moving really fast to make these kinds of primitives less impactful. That said, when you have a driver like this that gives you so many options, there's probably at least one of them that will work to some degree. But you know, I just wanted to use this topic as a launch point to talk a little bit about how much Microsoft has been doing to secure the platform against those types of primitives. All right,
Fair enough.
so up next we have a Talos report in Nitro Pro PDF in its JavaScript implementation, which is based on SpiderMonkey. Yet again, extreme PDF support rearing its head here. This was a bug involving a stack pointer going out of scope of a function and thus being accessed as a stale pointer. The Talos post goes into a lot of background detail, which honestly, if you're not already somewhat familiar with SpiderMonkey and the code they're talking about, you are probably going to get lost in it. It took me like an hour to read this topic and try to understand what they were talking about. I feel like they went a little bit too deep on the little details, just because of that lack of accessibility. Then again, the Talos reports have always kind of been targeted towards people who understand that code base, so um, that's not too much of a surprise, I guess. Anyway, the main issue is one of the things the PDF specification includes is a JavaScript extension to allow document creators to automate certain aspects of the document and, quote, improve interactivity. In Nitro Pro PDF, this is done through something called bindings, which can be implemented with your own custom classes and objects in its API. Whenever one of those bindings needs to be executed, this function called JSInvoke is called, which will allocate stack space by pushing a JSStackFrame structure onto the execution stack for the current JS context, and then it'll do some setup before calling the binding. And one of the things that setup will do is it'll link the newly created stack frame to the parent context in a linked list, then switch the context into that newly created stack frame. The main thing there is all of this is being done on the stack. So if that function ever returns for whatever reason, those stack frames will all go out of scope and are effectively dangerous to access. Um, because when you're accessing the stack, if your stack pointer is above um, where you're trying to access, then some other process or some other function in the stack can write malicious data there. Anyway, after all that setup is done, it'll call into the JS native binding using that JS stack frame, and its results are written to the address that was passed in its parameters. Where the issue starts to happen is what if you invoke the document.flattenPages functionality for flattening PDFs in a way that can fail, or just any binding in a way that can fail? Well, that function will register a structured exception handler before allocating the space for its stack frame. So if you can get that exception thrown, such as in the case of flattened pages by having annotations for pages being referenced incorrectly, it'll execute any other exception handlers that were registered during compilation. The first of which does this somewhat weird thing where it'll convert the exception to a different exception and then throw that. And the side effect of that is the next exception handler that was defined in the function gets skipped. And that can cause problems in the invoke function because while usually it'll pop those stack frames that were used to execute the binding after executing it and restore the context from that stack frame, that code ends up getting skipped, which leads to a stale stack frame remaining attached to the context because those stack frames were never properly cleaned up. So later on, after the invoke function returns, when SpiderMonkey's library tries to compile and evaluate that code, it'll write to this stale object in the linked list of stack frames, which can be set to malicious data. And they note that this can be used to trigger code execution. So it seems they've already confirmed that aspect of it. Unfortunately, as is usual with Talos, there's no public POC. So I did have to make some assumptions with what they provided on how it works. So I might be off on one of the deeper details, and if I am, I apologize, because it's hard for me to confirm my understanding with no other information to go off of. Usually I like to look at the POCs to verify that what I read was how it is working, but I can't do that here. So,
They do
and
say so. I didn't go and look for a POC with this one. I just with what was written, but they do mention in the provided proof of concept.
they do that with all their reports, though. They've
So I
done that with a
mean,
few WebKit reports I've looked at before, and there's no actual. I think it's because they pull it from like an internal report they send, and they just don't have a link like to the POC that would normally be there in their internal report.
oh, perhaps yeah.
Because I've noticed that with most of their posts. But yeah, like I said, there is a lot of details in there if you're interested, but you will have to cut through a lot of them or be familiar with SpiderMonkey and the underlying details. But yeah, main thing there is the stack pointer ends up getting used instead of scope, and that's because of that insane chain of exceptions if document.flattenPages fails. It'd be cool to see if there's ever any exploit written for this. There have been some Talos posts in the past where even though there is no POC, just the crash details and the write-up that they release is enough for somebody to go and try to implement it. So I don't know if we'll see that happen here, but I would be interested to see how this could be exploited, just because like a stack pointer going out of scope and being accessed is a somewhat rare Vuln class. I don't know if we've covered one that's been exploited on the podcast before,
I'm not sure if
because
we've
stack spraying is
actually.
just a very weird technique compared to like the heap is a lot more versatile than the stack when it comes to spraying it. So
Yeah, well, the heap gives you a lot more control over what data, like that, what data is actually making the use or changing it. On the stack, like there's a chance that you might just get lucky, or they might just be fairly lucky with what lands where. The fact that it's also in dealing with the PDF makes me feel like there's probably some pretty significant chunks of data that will also end up being parsed out onto the stack. I feel like there's a pretty reasonable chance that you can just control like a blob of data somewhere.
yeah, I have no doubt that this could be exploited and taken to code execution. I trust their word on that. I'd just be personally interested in how they go about it. But yeah, I mean, might have to wait and see if somebody goes back and tries to exploit that problem.
I'll also shout out what Blika just mentioned in chat. Exploiting stack issues usually results in more stable exploits. Yeah, I mean, with the heap, you've got a lot more unpredictability because of that same amount of I guess attacker control, or at least attacker influence that you're able to get on the stack. It's a lot more stable, but that also restricts the attack perspectives.
Yeah, the stack's a lot more deterministic. There's kind of that trade-off there. All right. In another Talos report, we have an info leak in Microsoft Azure Sphere Security Monitor, which is a custom Linux-based operating system for IoT applications to use. They focus in on this one system call, being SMSyscallPeripheralAcquire. Um, I believe this is used for like changing the modes on various pins and whatnot on the IoT device. But that syscall takes an input buffer, input size, output buffer, and output size. The input and output sizes must be at least hex 8 bytes, and the buffers must be valid pointers. That's fairly standard when you're doing validation and syscalls. And that input buffer is interpreted as a series of peripheralAcquire input objects, which is what allows you to switch the multiplexing mode to change a given pin, and the layout of how the pins are configured. I'm not going to go too deep into that because they don't really either, and it's not too relevant to the bug. The output then consists of how many entries were processed, how many have an output object, and then the output objects themselves, which contain information for that pin. Long story short, one of the fields in that output object, which is a 16-bit field, seems to be uninitialized in the output. We don't know what that field is. It's kind of labeled as unknown. It could have been some field that they planned to use in development, but then they just didn't, so it was left uninitialized. They never zero out the object or anything, so 2 bytes of kernel heap memory can leak through that field. So this is just a classic uninitialized read yielding info leak. Pretty straightforward bug. It is a pretty weak primitive as far as info leaks go. 2 bytes really isn't a lot. It could be enough for an exploit, but you have to do a lot of work to exploit a 2-byte leak. Although when you're talking about the heap, like we were just saying with the last topic, it is a lot more versatile. You do have a lot more control. So it's a lot more useful to take, or it's a lot more likely you could take advantage of a 2-byte leak in the heap. But the other thing is too, you can influence the amount of objects that are in the output, so you could leak more than 2 bytes each shot. It's just that your slot into uninitialized memory is only 2 bytes. And
Yeah,
especially
no,
kernel
it's
heap, it's pretty influential. So I think you could exploit this, but it's not as trivial to exploit as the bug might suggest initially.
and I mean obviously with this you're dealing with or it's going to be part of a chain. You're using it as the info. We're not getting code execution. So you would need something else.
Jay Rosner in chat asked, are these 32-bit or 64-bit processors? Interesting question. I don't think they really elaborate on whether or not they're 32-bit or 64-bit.
I made the assumption that these were 32-bit, but I don't believe they actually call that out here. You might be able to call it out. I was thinking, it's IoT, so already kind of low, and I did notice that they were using like IDs of 32-bit size, so that just made me think 32 bits rather than actually confirming it.
It is a really good thing to bring up, though, because that does make a significant difference in how useful the leak is. Because if it's 32-bit, your pointers are going to be 4 bytes. Being able to leak 2 bytes is pretty significant there. You can probably guess the upper 2 bytes of a 32-bit pointer, whereas a 64-bit pointer, 2 bytes is a lot less useful. So that is a good question. I do kind of wish they talked about that. But yeah, they don't really talk about the details of the system too much. And like I said, with the Talos report, that's kind of the way they do it. They just tunnel in on the background information that's somewhat relevant for the bug, and they don't provide any more than they need to, I guess.
Yeah, one thing that I did find interesting here was just the fact they did call out that with these devices, they do filter the syscalls that processors are allowed to hit. So that actually, I don't recall if you mentioned this, but this also isn't reached by just like your standard, basically no privilege user. You do need to have, code execution already within like a process that has this cap peripheral pin mapping capability. And I did find it interesting just to hear that they are using syscall filtering in addition. So requiring the capability, but also the processes themselves have the filters placed on what syscalls they can use. Which is, I mean, we're definitely seeing it a little bit more and more often. We're seeing it more on like, mobile phones definitely have it already. Well, actually, I guess iOS should have something of that type. I'll put it this way. Android is doing it. Um, I assume you've got that over on iOS too. So it's interesting to see it hitting its way, especially on some that's supposed to be more like a IoT or I guess SOC in this case, but used with the IoT applications. Seeing that level of security there, although it is also with Azure, so make sense, but I did want to call out the fact they are taking some additional steps around the security.
Something I'll throw in there is browsers are another product that generally employs some like BPF filtering for Linux for filtering syscalls. They've been that's seen a lot of movement in the last couple of years too, actually, with how they've been doing the Chrome sandboxing. But yeah, like you said, IoT is not really a place I'd expect to see it in. So yeah, that was definitely interesting to see. But yeah, not too many other details on that one. I just thought it was an interesting issue in terms of how you could take it to an exploit. Because, 2-byte leak is kind of, it's easy to brush off if you're trying to look for an issue. But
Yeah, I mean it's limited, but I mean that's still 2 bytes. We were already talking about earlier on a 32-bit system. Leaking it really on either side takes out a lot of the entropy that might be there. Like even if you leak the high or lower 2 bytes, it's still actually going to be somewhat useful. 64, it's less useful, but then it comes down to the fact, as you said, you can repeat this and get multiple leaks. Depending on the data structures that exist, like you might be able to get something useful out of that. It can be a lot of memory depending on how many you're leaking. So yeah, it would actually be kind of an interesting bug to exploit.
yeah, and I did just want to comment on why you were saying there with like being able to leak even half of the 32-bit pointer. Being able to leak the lower half in particular would probably be more useful. And the reasoning for that is usually the way that the memory is segmented for defining like what is userland accessible and what is kernel is they'll use like a limit. So usually the upper bits of a kernel address are going to be fixed, or they're going to be predictable in some way, whereas the lower bits are usually used for like the entropy. So thought I'd just throw that in there for people who weren't aware with how the kernel addressing stuff worked. There is some interesting ways you can break down a kernel address. And that's something I've always liked to talk about. Anyway, we'll move on to our next topic, though, which is a use after free and double free in libcurl. This was reported on HackerOne by Z2 underscore. I like to think that he was inspired by your name, Z. Probably not, but just headcanon. That's what I put in my head. Fairly obvious as far as use after frees go. When processing MQTTs, which is a publish subscribe protocol, which is usually used for IoT type stuff, the MQTT doing function will send the remainder of the outgoing packet using the send leftovers pointer that it sets up, and it'll then free that pointer. But it never clears a reference on that field in the message queue, which means if that function gets called multiple times, and end send and send leftovers don't change, it can just be freed multiple times, yielding the double free. So by having an unsuccessful transmission that requires sending another message of the leftover bytes, you can get that code executed and trigger a double free. In the impact section, the author notes that double freeing of Tcache chunks are not detected until glibc 2.29 or higher. So this is perfectly exploitable on systems running older versions of glibc. There was a little bit of back and forth with the researcher and the curl staff and the comments, arguing against the exploitability angle that the researcher provided. One of the things they noted was this would kind of be a self-attack because it would be very hard to get a victim application into performing those steps. They also stated how they weren't sure how this could be leveraged for memory corruption. The researcher does go on, though, to point out how that could be taken advantage of. And the reason that double free can be so dangerous in glibc heap is basically because the Tcache, which is like a per thread cache, can be poisoned to get an arbitrary write. And what he's talking about there is the thread cache is implemented in glibc as this last in first out linked list, and each entry has a pointer to the next entry in the list. So if you can get a pointer in the free list twice, you can gain control over the next pointer of an existing entry so that that next allocation returns a pointer that you completely control, giving you an arbitrary write.
Yeah, this sort of like the Tcache corruption here is a fairly common technique. That said, I really just wanted to point out kind of the discussion back and forth here, purely because of the fact that, Badger, in this case, the curl staff, ultimately did come onto the side of, yeah, this is definitely in the security problem camp now versus just a random crash. Um, just, it's nice to see a positive interaction when it comes to questioning the exploitability of an issue rather than just, well, we've seen a handful of times where somebody doesn't think it's exploitable, therefore they close the bug as won't fix or something without even um giving the reporter a chance to basically defend it, or just not accepting any sort of defense. So I mean, just a generally positive interaction here.
Yeah. Something I wanted to take out of chat from Jay Rosner, which is curl support MQTT question mark. So, I mean, yeah, I found that a little bit weird too. Curl seems, I mean, I know it is like a library and they want to have it be featureful. It does seem weird though, where MQTT, as far as I'm aware, is pretty much isolated to like IoT type use cases. So it is a bit interesting that curl supports that. But yeah,
Yeah, and
I
I'm not
mean,
even exactly sure what a file lookup looks like for Mosquito. MQTT is Mosquito. Um, oh no, so I haven't really used it. I'm familiar in passing with it, but if you're making any sort of file request, like, yeah, I don't know, just I'm used to it being more for message passing, not really like not something I'd associate with curl. But I guess if it has an HTTP compatible API, it kind of makes sense.
yeah, it is a little weird. But
Yeah, I feel like this is one of those cases where like it's going to take some social engineering, I think, for a lot of people to actually like, execute curl with such a URL.
yeah, so that is something I did want to circle back to. Is one of the first comments posted by Badger was saying, to me, it seems very hard for an attacker to trick an application in libcurl into performing the necessary steps um, to get the second free to do anything useful. And that wasn't really addressed. Like, I think we can both agree that this is a security issue, and it's good that it got classified as such and fixed. But on the practicality aspect, I don't know how practical it would be to pull off this exploit because that is still a factor. It does seem like you would have to do some extensive social engineering to actually take advantage of this, unless you were just doing a self attack.
Yeah, I mean it. I could imagine, there are some web apps and such out there that will call curl with user provided information. That on its own can be considered a vulnerability, SSRF. But I can definitely imagine some scenarios where it could happen. Especially if that's all, and that's all that seems to be necessary for this one. Key thing being establishing that connection and then, having that connection fail. So it seems like all you'd really need is that one kind of trigger. And that's what they say in the repro steps. I think they just say, yeah, supply an MQTT URL. So just have the mosquito URL there. And I could imagine there being some bug in some program that would enable that. So
Okay,
like it
fair
can
enough.
be hit remotely. It can be hit by an attacker. It's just like for the average user, not much of an issue, but like there's still the attack surface.
Overall, though, like you said, the nice thing to see from this report was just that that positive back and forth where even though curl staff initially thought this might not be exploitable beyond like a small leak or something, the research was able to kind of get through and explain why it could be dangerous, and they didn't stick to their guns on saying that it's not a security bug. So that was good to see. Moving on to something that has a lot larger of an impact, though, Trend Micro put out a partial analysis of NSO Group's leaked iPhone zero-click, known as ForcedEntry, that was used in Pegasus. They did this using samples from Citizen Lab. Given that it's a zero-click, you'd be right in assuming the initial vector for this was through iMessage. Specifically, the entry point was through iMessage message parsing of malicious PDF attachments. The vulnerability was an out-of-bounds write when parsing a specific encoding format called JBig2 in the core graphics framework. For those able to see the screen, they have some reversed pseudocode, which I'll scroll down to here. For the read text region method, where it tries to calculate the number of symbols or glyphs in the encoded data. The problem there is on the 5th line, where it adds the segment size to the number of symbols, unsigned count indiscriminately. So there's the potential for the integer overflow there, where numSims could be set to a size that's smaller than one JBig2 segment size, which is a problem because when it goes to fill the symbol table with values in bitmap, it relies on that segment size. So it could end up writing out of bounds if the allocated size is smaller than one JBig2 segment size. They didn't detail any other exploits in the chain. This was the only entry point, or this was only the entry point. The kernel vector wasn't really included here, and I haven't seen an analysis of that yet. So that might be something we circle back to at some point. They do point out some worrisome observations, though, with the crash. Notably, the fact that the sample suggests that Pegasus disabled ASLR before exploiting this bug, which is pretty damn notable because this ultimately is a parser bug, and the main stipulating factor of parsing bugs is usually they're not exploitable on modern systems without chaining it with another issue, because you need too much knowledge of the memory layout. Well, it seems that wasn't really an issue here.
Well, so to be clear, all they're working off here is a crash dump where they had two, or a crash log, sorry, where they had two crashes visible. One was in the
Yeah.
PSD stuff, the other one in this PDF. There could have been another exploit used beforehand for the info leak for something else. We don't have that information. They didn't see that in the logs. The fact they're working just off the logs does kind of limit what we're able to see about what happened. So all they can really determine is, yes, they had already, bypassed PAC, pointer authentication,
And
and
ASLR.
ASLR. Yeah.
Yeah, and the reason they noted they were able to bypass PAC is because in the crash, I think they replaced a virtual function to get code execution, and that should be protected by PAC. So you're right. I mean, they could have exploited another issue before this one, but the reason that I find it weird is this is the zero-click vector, which means this should be the first thing getting exploited, realistically. They note that this is exploitable through iMessage, the PDF attachments, seemingly without you needing to like open the attachment or anything like that, because they know that this is the zero-click vector.
True.
So,
Although we do also know, I believe that this is the second. They do mention this is the second crash. So that PSD crash did happen before this. It's possible that that is where they were able to get some information out of.
oh wait,
Um,
okay,
that
so,
was kind of my thought, at least. Obviously, we don't really know
hmm,
exactly what happened, or I think we've got the image here for the two crashes. Uh, am I possibly mistaken here? Because I see the JBig 2 stuff here right at the top of the image, which means that that might have been the first crash, or this is just a picture of. Yeah, this is just the one. Sorry, I was reading a little bit incorrectly. That said, I do believe they refer to this as kind of being the second crash. Our analysis focuses on the second crash. So it could have been in that first one where they were able to get more information.
okay, so basically, it could be the same bug. It's just that the like side effects of the first crash were more useful, or the scenario of the first crash was more useful. Okay, that kind of makes sense. But yeah, nonetheless, I mean, they said that it was worrisome to them that they were able to disable ASLR like that, and PAC as well, because the whole idea of those mitigations is to make bugs like this not useful to exploit. So
Yeah, but
yeah, I
it's
mean,
not surprising that they did. I mean, they're launching an exploit. Of course, they're going to have a full chain figured out for it.
yeah. So getting around the mitigations isn't what was scary. I think it was just the timing of how quickly they were able to get around them. Um, in user space, especially pointer authentication codes. That one I'd be very interested to see how that was circumvented. Because when they initially came out, I remember QWERTY or Luca pointing out that they were a bit weak and that there were ways around them. But I thought by this point they would be pretty strong. So
Didn't I think it was Brandon Falk who's done some points or some presentations on pointer authentication. And what he ended up finding was that he reported some bugs a year ago and then looked at Apple's pack again a year later and it was still just as bad, if not worse. We'll see if I can find that presentation. I think I did a shout out for it.
yeah, you're thinking of Brandon Azad. Some dude
Yeah.
just pointed out in chat. Yeah, because that was a Project Zero post. I remember that now that you bring it up.
Well, no, there was two Black Hat presentations are the ones that I'm thinking of.
Okay, there was also a Project Zero post that we covered on the
Yeah,
podcast
it
that
was
talked about
someone
POC.
from Project Zero though. Yeah, it wasn't now that you're out of chat, some dude 456 saying Brandon Falk is Gamozo. No, that's probably who it is. I was looking at some of his stuff recently, so that's probably why I had the name in mind. But yeah, Brandon Azad, uh, from Project Zero is who I was thinking of, who's done research into pack. Uh Basically found some surprising issues. And
Yeah,
I'm also mistaken on Brandon Azad's now over at Apple rather than Project Zero.
yeah. I think he left Project Zero last year, if I remember correctly.
Okay, then maybe
Um,
I'm like a year off on my guesstimates on the date.
yeah. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'd be very interested to know like how some of these mitigations were gotten around. I don't know if we'll get more information on that in the future, where they're kind of limited to the citizens lab samples. They might not be able to know all the specific details there. And like I said earlier, that this is only really covering the one vulnerability. Um, I don't. That doesn't really cover like the kernel bug or whatever. So it'll be interesting to see if more comes out around some of the other stuff other than this vulnerability. If it does, we'll be sure to cover it. But yeah, we'll just have to wait and see what happens with that, I guess. Um, Balika says Tigra is the only SoC I know that does secure boot on deep sleep. Um, are you referring back to when we were talking about the secure boot stuff? But yeah, anyway.
And I put in chat, I'll have in the description the pointer authentication talk that I was thinking of from Black Hat 2020, which is looking at pack 1 year later. And it refers to the Project Zero post, and it's 1 year since those findings.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll have that in the description of the VOD as well when it's on YouTube. But yeah, we'll just have to wait and see if anything else comes out with that. It was cool because we kind of wanted to talk about the NSO group exploit that was released for iOS because it is very significant, obviously. But at the time when we were looking around, we could only really find the fact that it had happened. There wasn't really many technical details out. So yeah, it was cool that Trend Micro wrote this up and we're able to talk about a zero-day chain being used. There was some discussion too around people thinking that maybe the media has been blowing these chains at a proportion a little bit. Just stating that while people should update ideally, because there's no reason not to update if you want to be secure from it, these chains aren't being used on everyday people carrying around iPhones, right? They are targeted attacks. I don't know if that's really a discussion we want to go into with regards to.
I mean, we've had that discussion a number of times. I don't think we want to go too deep today. I mean, basically, like, you should update. These things do leak. Exploit kits do occasionally use O days. And I mean, it's still like, just because it's being targeted doesn't mean that like some of our listeners might not have some reason to be targeted. That is kind of one thing. You don't always recognize the intelligence value that you might have access to. Um, Obviously, some people probably do recognize that's fairly small, but I don't know. I just don't. Um,
You
I'll
don't
just
think it's
I'll
being blown out of proportion too much?
I don't really follow what all of the news on it has been to say if it's really blowing out.
Okay. It's just something I wanted to bring up because it has been talked about. But yeah, that is a good point to bring up as well, is that even though most people might not be targeted, some of the people reading those news articles or seeing it on the news or whatever, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't be a valuable intelligence target. So yeah, I think that's
Yeah,
a good
and actually, as
final point to
some
put on that.
dude kind of said, like, they are journalists being targeted. Like, journalists are fairly, normal people. I mean, these ones in particular were some activists. That, like, I don't think that's an excuse, though, for any of it.
Yeah. All right. But yeah, don't have much more to bring up on that topic. And actually, that is the end of our topics for what we have this week. So yeah, thank you to everyone who tuned in. You can catch the VOD on Twitch or on YouTube at 8 p.m. Eastern on Wednesday. We also have previous podcasts up on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more links on Anchor. Feel free to join our Discord and follow us on Twitter. I'll put the link in chat for that. If you have any questions or topics that you want brought up for future episodes or any questions on the topics we covered today, feel free to leave those in the comments or in the Discord as well. But yeah, with that said, we'll be back next Monday for our bounty episode, which is at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific, and next Tuesday for the binary episode, which is at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. And we'll see you all then.